Hello, I'm Stuart Craner, co-founder of Thinkers50. Welcome to this series of Thinkers50 at Hult webinars we are presenting during June. This is the final one in the series, so thank you to all of you who have joined and enjoyed the sessions so far, and thank you for joining us today. As always, please let us have your observations, thoughts, queries, questions at any time during the session, and I'll be sure to pass them on. Today, we're joined by Matt Johnson. Matt is a speaker, writer, and researcher specializing in the application of psychology and neuroscience to branding. Following his PhD in cognitive psychology from Princeton, his work has probed the science of brand storytelling, experiential marketing, and consumer decision-making. He is the co-author of the top-selling consumer psychology book, Blind Sight, The Mostly Hidden Ways Marketing Reshapes Our Brains, which came out in 2020, and most recently, Branding That Means Business, which came out last year. Matt is also passionate about helping brands harness insights from neuroscience to better understand, serve, and interact with their consumers. To this end, he consults with a wide array of organizations throughout the world, including being an expert in residence for Nike. Matt currently lives in Boston, where he is a professor of psychology and marketing at Hult International Business School and an instructor at Harvard University's Division of Continuing Education. Matt, welcome. Where do we start? I mean, how do you describe what you do in your area of expertise?
It's great to be here, Stuart. Thanks so much for having me. So I think my work is really inherently interdisciplinary. So as you mentioned, originally I come from the world of academic neuroscience. And so my work at that time really aimed to understand the neuroscience of sensation and perception, and ultimately the neuroscience of communication. So essentially how we take in the raw sensory signals in our environment, how we interpret these, how we build these rich inner landscapes, and then ultimately how we communicate these concepts and ideas in the social environment. And then really now for the past 10 years, my work and my writing and my research is really focused on applying this neuroscientific perspective to questions of marketing and really helping brand managers and marketing specialists sort of harness insights from psychology and neuroscience to better understand their consumers and also generate more compelling, more creative campaigns as well.
Yeah, it always strikes me that how do you actually do research in this area? I mean, that's one of the first challenges and something people generally probably don't understand, how you go about researching it.
So there's a number of different methodologies. So one is using sort of classic tools of neuroscience. So neuroscience has availed itself of sort of a vast array of different neuroimaging technologies. These go by, there's a bunch of sort of fancy names for them. So there's EEG, which is shorthand for electroencephalography. And these are these sort of shower caps with electrodes over the scalp, and they're sort of measuring electrical activity coming from the brain, and that's sort of tied and tethered to underlying psychological processes. There's also fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, where you're effectively putting somebody inside this big magnetic scanner and you're having them do something while they're in the scanner. They're either watching a movie or they're doing a very simple task or they're doing some sort of simple decision making. And you're essentially eavesdropping on the brain as these processes are unfolding. And so you can get creative with this approach from a consumer neuroscience or a neuromarketing perspective and have them, for example, make buying decisions while we're sort of eavesdropping on the brain. And so you can, for example, present some potential products and you're sort of listening to what's happening in the brain as this evaluation of products are taking place. And then you can also, for example, give them an example of how much this would cost. And so you have, let's say, some nice Nike shoes. And you're looking at these Nike shoes and you're sort of monitoring the corresponding brain regions which are evoked at this presentation. And then you have sort of the price of these, which is also sort of spurring this pattern of neural activity at the brain. And some really interesting research by colleague Brian Newton has found that essentially the delta between the evoked activity in product presentation in a region deep in the brain called the nucleus accumbens, minus the activity in a part of the brain called the insular cortex, which is essentially the pain center in the brain. The delta between these activities corresponds very, very strongly to one's actual intent in trying to make a purchase. So that is the pleasure that's evoked from the product minus the corresponding activity in pain-oriented regions of the brain corresponds very directly to purchase intent. So just as one example of how these technologies are used to try and understand these sort of processes of marketing and consumer psychology, that would be one.
I mean, I suppose organizations and academics have been trying to understand more about consumers for time immemorial. Is there really a lot more to learn about consumer behavior?
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's sort of the promise of taking a sort of a consumer neuroscience perspective. Is that we're really able to uncover or hope to uncover some of these underlying mechanisms, which we, as the consumer who's making the decision, seem sometimes to be completely oblivious about. So this is sort of a very classic finding in psychology and neuroscience that we're often oblivious to our own decision making and to the actual influences that land us on one choice over another. And there's a fantastic example of this that I'd love to talk about in classes from Wilson and Nesbitt way back in the 1970s, where they brought people into a lab and they presented them with this sort of array of stockings. And they just said, okay, we'll pick whichever stocking you like. And then, all you have to do is just tell us why you picked this stocking. And so the participants go up and they make this selection and they come back and they talk to the researchers about it. And that was essentially the experience of the consumers in this. What was interesting is that human beings have this very consistent right side bias. And when we don't know the sort of confines of this decision making process, and we don't know really what makes a good stocking or bad stocking, we just sort of default to the right side of visual space. And by and large, people simply selected whichever stocking was on the right side of space. And so people came back and they talked to the experimenters about why they chose what they chose. And they had all of these confabulatory ideas. They said, oh, I liked, this one because it had the color, and this one, the stitching was really fine. This one reminded me of my grandmother. They had all of these very, very elaborate explanations as to why they selected the stocking that they selected. Nobody, not a single participant in the study said, oh, I selected it because it's on the right side of visual space and I have a right side bias. And yet that was by far the most predictive factor of what somebody was going to pick. And so we're oftentimes oblivious to the true motivations of our own behavior and our own decision making. And really the hope of consumer neuroscience, of neuromarketing, of sort of applying a neuroscientific lens to this process is we begin to sort of uncover some of these more unconscious processes.
Man, I just think the idea of us being oblivious to our own decision making is just is a fantastic. Is it kind of amazingly human and depressing at the same time, isn't it? Or perhaps that's where the opportunity lies.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a bit scary when, we sort of think about it because, we feel as if we're the author of our choices and we feel as if, we have complete autonomy in the moment and we feel very much that we're making a good rational decision, which is deliberative and which is availed of all of this, good data and good logical argumentation. And yet when we sort of unpack the decision, we sort of unpack the variables which are actually producing these decisions and these choices, we find that there's oftentimes a big difference between the motivations that the person claims led to a given outcome and the actual variables that seems to be relatively decisive in landing a person at a given choice.
Elizabeth from Denmark says, the right side bias, is that neurologically connected to why people typically have left side neglect?
It's a fantastic question. This is sort of, debated endlessly in the field. I mean, we do have slightly different strengths for our different sort of hemispheres. So the right side of the brain is paying attention to the left side of the visual world, and the left visual cortex is paying attention to the right visual world. And there's a little bit of sort of peaks and troughs in terms of how these hemispheres are specialized for different types of visual percepts. And it does seem that we have a much more global attentional biased towards the right half of visual space, whereas on the left half of visual space, we're much more detail oriented. So we tend to just default to where we have a better sort of global understanding of what's going on there. I should point out that this is a bias that shows up really when we're operating under uncertainty, when we're really don't know what else to pick, and we're sort of shifted easily in either direction. We tend to sort of default to the right side of visual space.
Let's talk about a bit about your book, Blind Sight, which is really good, and it's full of those amazing pieces of information that make you read books. All watch ads show 10 past 10 on the time. All restaurant chains use red and yellow in their logos. Can you tell me first about the watch ads? Why do they show 10 past 10? I must admit I'd never noticed that.
Yeah, so this is something that consumers themselves sort of started to observe over the last 10, 15, 20 years, is that watch ads always tend to have 10-10 on the advertisements, and it's sort of always depicting this sort of uppercase V shape here. And this is actually studied experimentally, and they found that when watch ads have a sort of a V shape like this, it does produce sort of slight feelings of happiness and connection. And of course, this being because this is a smile shape. As human beings, we have a very socially oriented way of looking at the world. So all cognition is social cognition, and the way in which we are social also informs how we perceive these clearly inanimate entities. So even if we know intellectually it's a watch, we still can't help seeing human-like attributes in these things. And so when these point to a certain expression, as being social creatures, we can't help but sort of feeling the emotions associated with that expression. So it's a relatively small effect size. It's not as if you see a watch with 10-10 and you just get elated. But it does, on average, make the median consumer a little bit happier and draw a bit more connection to watches that have that depiction. And so you can see why watch brands have sort of slowly converged onto this over time.
What about the red and yellow thing? Because you've done work, amongst many things, and you've done work on the psychology of color and branding.
Yeah, so there's some interesting debates in the field about color psychology, and I think the everyday consumer sort of has a sense in which colors sort of influence how they're feeling. So we might associate blue with being calm. We might associate green with nature. We might associate red with being intense, or orange with being intense. And brands have converged onto this as well. It's a debate in terms of whether these are sort of inherent in the color themselves, and they give rise to similar emotions across culture and time, or whether they also carry some cultural connotation as well. And the story seems to be that it's a bit of both. And so when it comes to color in brand logos for restaurants, especially fast food chains, the general idea here is that this is two very high contrast colors. So red really pops next to yellow, and vice versa. That these are two colors generally associated with sort of action and sort of rising to the occasion, whereas colors such as blue and green we typically don't associate with food. There's this great George Carlin sketch where he's talking about there's no blue food, and blueberries aren't blue, they're purple. There's really no blue food out in the world. And there's been some research on this, and it's actually found that when you have a regular soup and there's no actual need for color in it, and you just use food dye to either make it blue or make it red or make it any other color, people eat the least amount from the blue colored soup. And so it seems that we have this sort of natural aversion to blue foods because this is never ever seen in nature. And so from an evolutionary perspective, we feel much safer with red and yellow and orange and things that sort of appear naturally in foods in nature, and much less so with things like blue. If a food is blue and it shows up on your plate, and it's not some avant-garde restaurant design, chances are that's something to be concerned about.
What's really amazing about your work, Matt, is it's just wide-ranging, and you're going lots of different places. I mean, some of your recent work's about looking at luxury fashions and what's happening there. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So luxury fashion is an area that I'm personally very fascinated by, because this is really an area where we see the massive contribution of psychology and neuroscience. So you can find a tote bag for $1.50 that'll carry your stuff, and that's fine, and it has that utility. But people are regularly paying 20, 30, 40, 50 grand for a bag that has the same utility. And that delta between $1.50 and $50,000 is, I would argue, almost purely psychological, and has to do with the feeling that you get from owning the bag, the sense of status you feel. It comes from the self-expressive nature of the bag. And this is where things really, I think, get fascinating, because I think it's no secret that luxury fashion brands, really high-end brands, benefit from this sort of social signaling aspect, where the things that you wear signal something about who you are and what your values are and sort of where you stand in society. But what's interesting in this research is that there's this inverse correlation between how conspicuous the brand is in the luxury item and the degree of social value it holds. And so if you have, for example, Prada or Coach or sort of more lower end luxury fashion, it has its logo just completely emblazoned on it, and it's very obvious what brand that is. But the higher you go up in terms of the upper echelons of elite fashion, you get into sort of the Birkin bags, where we're talking $100,000 for one of these bags. It doesn't say Birkin anywhere on it, and it's a really interesting observation, because what it indicates is that if you know, if you have a Birkin bag, you have a Birkin bag. And when passersby sort of encounter you on the streets and they give you a certain look and they recognize it's a Birkin bag, now it's complex social signaling. So they know that you have a Birkin bag, and by them recognizing it, it says something to you about their status. They're in the same stratosphere, they're in the same know about luxury fashion as you are. And they are sort of a potential fellow elite. Has sort of social value in terms of the type of communities potentially you're trying to build. And so luxury fashion is one of the most fascinating elements, I think, of branding, because again, it's this massive delta between $1.50 tote bag, a 50 grand Hermes bag, and that delta is almost completely psychological. And really unpacking that reveals some really unintuitive elements about the consumer world.
Alex Rocha, who's watching, says red and yellow are colors most attractive to people with dementia.
Interesting. Yep, that's news to me. There's many types of dementia, so that may be true of maybe a subset of people with dementia. So yeah, could be.
Interesting. But the thing is, it's all interesting, isn't it? That's what's amazing about this, because we've all got those relationships with brands, and we're all making those decisions as consumers. So there's kind of a universality to what you're studying. And you've also done this, the relation between brand loyalty and the science of warmth.
Yeah. So this is so this is a really interesting application, I think, of social psychology to the world of branding. So brands in general, very, very concerned with brand loyalty. That's sort of the holy grail of branding, where you've sort of attracted people into your brand. They feel a deep sense of connection with it. They're going to engage in repeat patronage. They're going to engage in word of mouth. Like, you've done your job well as a brand manager when you've achieved brand loyalty. And there's this interesting science of what types of features of a brand and what types of relationships they build with consumers that actually produce brand loyalty. And so when most consumers think about brand loyalty, they think, all right, it's the punch card at my local sandwich shop, or it's the airline that I like to use. And there's been a lot of research now, and it turns out that those classic forms of brand loyalty don't actually produce loyalty over time. They are transactional in nature. So number one, they are ubiquitous. So any sandwich shop can offer these types of reward systems, and then you're just competing on infrastructure, and you're just competing on the tactics you're using to get consumers to come back. But most importantly, it is a way of relating to consumers, which fundamentally is inhuman. It's fundamentally transactional. You're saying, if you do this, I'll do this. And this is really where the science of warmth comes in, because there's been a lot of work in social psychology about why we like our fellow human beings. And it turns out that of all of the unique personality traits and all of the things that our fellow humans can exude, two really stand out. And this is their perceived intentionality, which is warmth, and their perceived competence. And so you can see why this would be very, very important to us humans as social creatures from an evolutionary standpoint. So you encounter somebody new, it doesn't matter if they're the life of the party, it doesn't matter if they're funny, it doesn't matter all of these other personality traits. But it really matters is what are their intentions and do they have the ability, the competence to act on those intentions? There's some fantastic research by Alex Todorov at Princeton University showing that within a matter of 300 milliseconds, so like a snap of a finger, we're already assessing people on dimensions of warmth and competence. And so this was applied by Susan Fisk, a colleague of Alex Todorov at Princeton University, to brands. And assessing brands on dimensions of warmth and competence, it turns out that the higher the brand is on warmth and competence, so sort of upper right in this grid, these are brands like Coca-Cola, Hershey's, Airbnb, Lululemon, some of the most beloved brands are high on warmth and competence. And so really this lays out a unique roadmap for how brands can try and create these more enduring bonds with their consumers. It's not necessarily about these transactional dynamics and competing on loyalty programs, but it's really about a demonstration of one's good intentions. It's not just about the immediate sale. It's not just this sort of tit for tat sort of set of transactions, but the brand actually has my best interest as a human being at heart. And sort of this again, this sort of expression of one's good intentions for consumers.
So that kind of gets to the role of brands in the loneliness epidemic, the kind of bowling alone world we live in. So the brands offer the warmth and the sense of community that's lacking in our social lives.
They can potentially, and this is an area that I'm very excited about as a research interest for me, because as you may be aware, Stuart, we're sort of living through this loneliness epidemic, essentially. So the American Surgeon General, came out just a few months ago and is sort of touring the country, sort of raising awareness about this, that we really have these unprecedented levels of loneliness. And over there in the UK, you guys just appointed a minister of loneliness to try and address this problem specifically. And so part of this was COVID and the pandemic and lockdowns. But if you look back and you sort of rewind the tape, this has been an upward trend going back to at least 2015. And in social psychology and sort of tying that to health outcomes, loneliness and not having a sense of connection and a sense of sort of close camaraderie with others is strongly associated, unfortunately, with some very deleterious health effects. And so you can see why the American Surgeon General and other leaders throughout the world are really trying to address this. And I do think there is a role for brands here. So I think on the agenda of many brands is not just getting consumers to frequent the brand and generate word of mouth and have great products and have a brand personality that differentiates, but actually really building a community around the brand. And this is definitely easier said than done, and it sort of has some business constraints that don't necessarily lend itself so well to the agenda item of a brand. But nonetheless, I think really represents an unmet need of the median consumer, which I think brands and to a certain extent corporations more broadly can, I think, hope to address.
Okay, let's take some questions. We've got people joining us from Sweden, Holland, Denmark, the States, India, and elsewhere. Somebody from LinkedIn says, marketing tends to be focused on influencing customers and consumers' behavior. Which of your insights can be used to influence the behaviors of colleagues?
It's a really interesting one. And I think the first thing off the bat is that when it comes to changing behavior, when it comes to changing consumer behavior, there really aren't these sort of one-off solutions that are going to work for all consumers and all time, all places, all cultures. There's one sort of the decision architecture, and this gets into sort of the nudge literature and sort of behavioral economics, and there's stuff at the point of sale which are going to sort of nudge a consumer in one direction or the other. I think that's a fascinating field. I also think it's really interesting to sort of go back upstream to this process, to the level of the brand, and really having as the brand a cultivation of desire, cultivation of wants. And this is where the brand gets into this sort of different uncharted territory of not just trying to drive behavior, but trying to cultivate desire, trying to cultivate a set of wants or needs for the consumer. And there's this very fascinating perspective called mimetic theory. There's a fantastic book just written by my friend Luke Burgess on this idea, coming from Rene Girard, that when it comes to human desires, humans are unique. When a dog has its basic needs met, it just goes to sleep. When a human being has their basic needs met, what do we desire? And Rene Girard put forward the idea that human desires are fundamentally social. They're fundamentally mediated by a social model. And when we don't have a sort of clear set of desires tied to our basic physiological needs, we desire what our social groups desire. We desire these sort of models for desire. And so in the moment, we desire, let's say, a Balenciaga jacket, or we desire vitamin water, and it feels direct and it feels spontaneous, it feels personal. But really, when we dissect this, that desire is mediated by a social model. And the more we can sort of unpack that social model and understand how this is mediated by the social environment, the better we are at sort of diagnosing why people desire what they desire and having the tools at our disposal as a brand to sort of drive those desires in an ethical way.
Yeah, what's amazing is you're getting down to the language you use, Matt, is you're getting down to the very essence of humanity, aren't you? How the human essence of our behavior.
Yeah, so that's what I think at the essence, the sort of core of my research agenda and my writing and my work is really tethering marketing to human nature. And so I think there's a very strong tendency as brand managers, as marketing specialists, to really try and understand how the world is changing, right? So everyone now is, of course, talking about AI, generative AI, ChatGPT. How are these things going to change the world? How is it going to change the world of work? What's the world going to look like in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? And trying to predict this and trying to understand how the world's going to shift is, of course, a very noble pursuit. This is necessary. I think through taking a neuroscience perspective, we can take a different and complementary approach, which is asking, instead of what's going to change, what's not going to change? What's going to be the same now as is going to exist in 15, 20, 30, 40 years? And especially if brands are operating as agents of B2C, if our end customers are human beings, the most fundamental aspect, which is going to remain unchanged, are the fundamental tenets of human nature. And of course, as human beings, this only gets us so far because we are complex, we're multifaceted, we're hypocritical. We don't have any sort of immutable traits, which are resistant to culture and resistant to time. But at the same time, there are some identifiable broad principles that can be understood, and these can be extremely helpful as brands aim to navigate the immense change that we're currently in.
Catherine Hall from New Mexico says, warmth is love. We're with you on that, Catherine. Thank you. Bogdan Bogdanovich says, if you feed AI with insights from neuroscience, are we going to have the ultimate branding in content marketing? So I suppose that's the question, Matt. If you take the stuff you're doing with AI, is that the ultimate? Are we almost we're going to totally understand the consumer?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So I think there's a couple ways this could play out. So one, generative AI as an analysis tool is increasingly being used not to apply to these massive text data sets and the imagery and the types of things that OpenAI is doing, but is actually being applied to neuroscientific data itself. So there's a fantastic example of this at University of Texas, Austin, where they had people watch these very simple video clips, and then they just fed the data of the brain as they're watching these video clips into a generative AI tool. And they created a decoder which took just the neural data and funneled that through a generative AI analysis tool, and that produced natural language which described that video. And so you have essentially the basic building blocks of what feels like mind reading, which is really pretty astounding. So the analysis tool didn't have access to the video, it just had access to the neural data evoked from the video. And from that is able to describe what the person just saw. And so this has, there's incredible applications for things like locked-in syndrome or dementias, where people have a difficult time articulating themselves. And so you have direct access to that. But I think it does have some really interesting implications for branding and marketing as well. So you think about generative AI, and this is an incredible tool to create novel output based on existing abstractions. And so Netflix, for example, currently struggles to have 10,000, 20,000 titles and have a personalized engine that delivers, here's the top 10 videos of all of your this personalized algorithm. Here's the top 10 videos just for you. And now generative AI can take that further and say, due to your unique preferences, and now the preferences that are elucidated for us through your brain, here's a novel video just for you. So it's not Netflix delivering a personalized video from its corpus of videos, its corpus of movies, but now generative AI has the potential to create a novel film output just for you. So it's taking personalization, which is already this broad trend in marketing and branding, and actually taking that to another really unprecedented level now with generative AI.
Anastasia from Greece kind of takes it in a different direction. She says that everything that creates an emotional connection between brands and their audiences lies at the center of building branding strategies. Do audiences, customers of different cultural backgrounds, have different triggers that brands can benefit from having such insights? I wonder, Matt, has anybody done, I suppose you do comparative research of how people respond to particular stimuli and see if there's cultural differences. Have people done that research?
Yeah, so this is a sort of a key area of marketing strategy, of brand strategy. I think, Anastasia, you're spot on that really the core of the brand strategy is about connecting with the target market. And the culture is this sort of master variable in doing so. It's sort of the operating system by which all of this is being orchestrated. There's lots of really interesting examples of brands that were, previously successful in one market and had a really resonant brand strategy in one market, and then shifted to a new geographic cultural market, and just didn't resonate. Maybe the product was the same, the service is the same, but now the brand personality just doesn't resonate. One example that comes to mind is Walmart. And so Walmart, this is a big American brand, built this brand on low prices and friendliness. So you have really great customer service, you have people smiling at you and sort of greeting you at the door. And they said, all right, well, this is, these are two universal traits, right? Who doesn't like low prices and happiness? And so they took this strategy and they went to Germany, and they found that Germans, love the low prices, but when they stepped foot in a Walmart physical retail location, and you had this sort of American style of sort of greeting somebody at the door and all smiley and eyes and teeth, it freaked the German consumer out, because that's just, I don't know if we have any Germans in the audience, but it's just not really the German way of doing things. I lived in Berlin for 7 months. I got sort of a feel for that myself, and it's just really not how the brand was going to resonate with that geographic market. So there's lots of examples of brands that have established themselves through the lens of one sort of set of cultural identities, and then try and take that to a novel cultural location, and again, it just doesn't resonate, unfortunately.
And more kind of specialized area, Juan Carlos from San Diego says, is there any research that demonstrates which location within a presentation page people tend to focus the most on? So you presumably, Juan Carlos, means you're doing a PowerPoint. Where do you put the killer details? Where do they need to be, on the right hand side or the left hand side as people are looking?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I know that there's a lot of research on looking at visual gaze for web pages, for example, as an element of UX research. And what happens there, which we might want to extrapolate to PowerPoint, is people engage in this very stereotyped F pattern, where they look sort of upper right first, and then they go across, then they go down, and then they go across again. And it spells out this sort of uppercase F shape. As Westerners speaking languages that are read left to right, that's sort of the natural direction in which we're going to go. So we're going to go to the top of the front page, just like we would for a book, and start reading across, and we're going to go down and do the same. And the opposite is observed in linguistic contexts in which languages is read the other way. So in Arabic or in Hebrew, for example, it's the opposite. And so I think we might expect the same types of pattern to emerge in PowerPoint. I can't think of a study that's addressed that specifically, but if I just sort of place my bets in terms of a hypothesis, I think that would be the case for PowerPoints as well.
It's quite amusing moving around so much, Matt. So thank you for moving around with us. And I was thinking about brands and political activism, because it seems to me that the old divides no longer exist. That there used to be brands would tend to steer clear of political activism, and now they're being drawn into the mire. I mean, I'm being pejorative already because I see the dangers of it. Is that the case? And how do you think brands are navigating it, or how should they navigate it?
This is a question that I think is keeping a lot of brand managers up at night. So on the one hand, they're getting calls from their consumers to take a side, right? So the brand has a personality, the brand has a set of attributes that you come to associate with it. And because we see brands as human beings, we also want these human beings to have opinions about things that we care about. And we want them to espouse the opinions that we personally have. And I think as polarization continues to ramp up and engaged in a deeply politicized society, it becomes strange for a brand not to have an opinion. It feels strange being a consumer of that brand not to have an opinion. So, whatever the case is, how do you not have an opinion about abortion? How do you not have an opinion about climate change? How do you not have an opinion about transgender rights? And consumers want brands to sort of signal how they stand on these issues. Brands, by and large, don't want to get into political debates. If they can just sort of keep going and they can sort of serve a broad swath of, let's say, the American consumer base, then they want to sort of just keep on doing that as much as possible. But occasionally you do see brands that are sort of drawn into that I think seem very unprepared for that stance. And we saw that most recently with Bud Light, with their sponsorship and their collaboration with Dylan. And I think it would have been fine if Bud Light would have taken a strong stance and said, okay, yes, we support transgender rights. We love Dylan. We sponsor, this collaboration. We're going to stand by it. But what we saw, of course, is that they had this espousing of a political position. There was backlash, which should have been anticipated, and they backed down and they walked away from it. So now you have, conservatives, if you have people that, didn't appreciate this stance, getting upset at the brands. At the same time, now that you're walking away from this, now you have progressives that are upset at you for not sort of standing by your position and sort of abandoning this so-called cause. And you get the worst of both worlds, which is that consumers don't know where you stand on this. They don't know if you're, pro-transgender rights, and you don't know if you're, don't have a strong opinion on this. And so this is the worst possible position for a brand to be in, because you are effectively an automata dangling on the sentiments of what consumers want. And if you're trying to be a strong brand that has its own unique, enduring personality and its own sort of enactment of the world, that's the worst possible position to be in. So yeah, I think brands are very hesitant, and I think for good reason on this. I think consumers want them to take a position, and I think they can take a position in certain instances. But if they do, they need to be 100% committed to it. Oftentimes, the backlash and the PR and everything that comes afterwards is much more damaging than the actual stance itself.
Gloria says, brands may have had an opinion in the past, but now there is a platform that is more transparent, which I suppose is true. But I'm not sure they did have opinions in the past. They sort of avoid them generally, in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends just sort of how far back. If we're rewinding the tape, I think brands have always had sort of implicit political positions. I think there's more pressure now for brands to really be explicit about those things and to really instantiate these things. If you look back, to the 1990s, Michael Jordan's famous claim that Republicans buy sneakers too. wants to be a mass market brand, wants to stay out of it. I think that's the default position for most brands. But for niche brands that are really trying to resonate with just a specific target market, it can be very conducive to take a very strong political position. Either we're with, progressive values, with conservative values, or we align ourselves with these specific causes. And if you're trying to resonate with a small, specialized target market that also shares that constellation of values, that can be a very efficient way to build that connection. But I think as brands get bigger and they're trying to be not just a progressive brand, not just a conservative brand, but an American brand, it becomes much more difficult to take very strong positions that really try to transcend these different political convictions.
So Matt, where does your work go now? What are you working on at the moment? I know you're the sort of person who has about 10 projects underway and all equally interesting. What are you working on at the moment?
Yeah, so a couple different plate spinning. Certainly, as you mentioned, I do like to stay busy with things. A lot of my work now is sort of trying to draw in perspectives from theoretical neuroscience into understanding consumer experiences. So there's this really exciting theory, this sort of grand theory about the brain, which is called predictive processing theory. And this is a general idea that when it comes to having internal phenomenological states, when it comes to any sort of perception, whether it's emotional or visual, what our brain is doing is it's projecting a prediction out into the world of what's causing this either sensory input or this emotional input. And so what we're ultimately experiencing is our brain's generative prediction. And then, of course, as sensory input either conflicts or corresponds with this prediction, it updates this model. And so it's no secret that predictions are very important for us as human beings, but this sort of takes it a step further and says what we experience internally is the prediction. So essentially, yeah, the promise is really trying to apply this perspective of predictive processing theory, that the prediction is the internal experience, and applying this to understanding consumer experiences. So just toggling very simple predictions that consumers have about an experience, not changing anything about the experience itself, but testing specifically how these predictions and how these sort of Bayesian priors, as we call them in neuroscience, how these impact the experience itself. And I think it's a really exciting project. I think these fields don't talk to each other really as much as they should. So we have sort of theoretical neuroscience, and we have empirical neuroscience on the one hand, and we have marketing practitioners on the other hand. Both are fundamentally concerned with trying to understand and predict human behavior, and yet they rarely ever chat to one another. And so my sort of research, my work, and really everything that I do is really about bridging this gap. And so that's one of the exciting nodes I'm excited to embark upon in the coming years.
How can people find out more about your work, Matt?
Absolutely. So I think the central place is my website, which is neuroscienceof.com. So just neuroscienceof.com. Got links to my research there, my consulting work. I host a blog both on the neuroscience of marketing and on the neuroscience of human nature. My goal is really to connect these things, and so people can find out sort of more about these ideas, and look forward to connecting people there.
And of course, they could buy the books, Blind Sight and Branding That Means Business, available in all good bookstores and online. Matt, thank you very much for joining us. Really fantastic subject. I'm sure we'll talk to Matt again in the future. Thank you, everyone who's joined us for this episode and the other episodes in Thinkers50 at Hult. Thank you.